Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again. They're back with another Marvel Snap video. So in this one, we're going to go over everything you need to know to dominate the new mode, Deadpool's Diner, releasing later today. Let's quickly go over everything we know about this mode for those who might not be too sure of what it is, how it's going to work, or why you might want to play it. And then we'll take a look at the decks and strategies that you can best use to dominate the diner. So what is Deadpool's Diner? Deadpool's Diner is a new limited time mode launching today and is going to be live through the remaining 2 weeks of this Marvel Snap July season. In terms of how the mode works, it's going to be relatively similar to just playing normal games on ladder. The thing that makes Deadpool's Diner different is using bubs instead of cubes. Bubs are your cube replacement. However, unlike cubes, these are not something you have an infinite supply of. Bubs are the currency specifically for this mode, and that is what you will be wagering in place of the normal cubes. When you run out of bubs, you will have to wait for them to recharge. Your bubs gradually refill once on the hour, taking 8 hours to fully refill. Alternatively, you can pay money or gold to speed up this process. However, that's not something I anticipate most players will be interested in doing. All the rewards in the diner are based around bub milestones. So even if you lose all your bubs, your progress towards the various rewards will remain intact. The other big thing that makes Deadpool's Diner different is the doubling mechanic. In a normal game of Marvel Snap, doubling happens when you or your opponent snaps, or when you complete the final turn of the game. Deadpool's Diner takes a different twist on this, enabling some higher stakes by having auto doubling occur at the end of turn 4, turn 5, and turn 6. That means in total, your initial bet can be doubled up to 5 times in one match of Deadpool's Diner. There will also be 15 different tiers or tables at the diner, each one requiring progressively more bubs for their initial buy-in. The total rewards you can obtain from playing Deadpool's Diner include 500 credits, 155 boosters, 300 gold, 1 title, 1 card back, 1 mystery variant, 1 premium mystery variant, 2 avatars, 19 various borders, the Cassandra Nova card, and her exclusive variant. In addition to additional bubs, as well as upgrades to your bub refill system. So that's Deadpool's Diner. Let's talk about how to best maximize your strategy for it and look at some decks that are capable of doing so. Decks that have a more deterministic outcome seem to benefit from this massively. What I mean by this is if you are a combo deck, or really any deck that can easily say, hey, I'm likely going to know I can win this game by turn 4 or turn 5, those decks get massively boosted by this mode. Because unlike in regular Marvel Snap, where you're getting 1 or 2 cubes before your opponent retreats, you have a lot more potential to get bigger earnings from that natural doubling. So naturally, any deck that makes it clear you have good odds of winning the game as early as turn 4, turn 5 is going to benefit massively from this system. Probably the easiest example that comes to mind are Clog decks. Clog decks are notorious for often clogging a lane on turn 4 or turn 5, and then using a variety of other tools like Shang, Red Hulk, Cannonball, etc. close out the game on the final turn. Normally, those decks don't have that high of a cube rate because opponents know when they've lost, and they're only losing 2 cubes unless they happen to snap back. Deadpool's Diner massively changes this dynamic, and I expect it to be a very large buff towards how effective these decks are in obtaining bubs. So with all that out of the way, let's take a look at some of the decks I would recommend to have success in the diner. And we're going to start off with the big 6-eyed elephant in the room, Arishem. Unless you've been living under a rock, you probably have noticed that Arishem is defining the metagame right now. It turns out having an extra energy every turn for the whole game is really, really strong, and the extra 12 cards in deck being random isn't really enough to offset that strength. Arishem also gains some benefit from the diner in that these random cards make it harder for your opponent to realistically play around everything, which can be really good for snap, cube, / bub equity. Here we have a pretty stock list. A lot of the Arishem stuff has been focusing on having card generation, interaction, and things that generally serve to annoy your opponent, like Leech and Dr. Octopus, while still putting out their own big threats in Blob and Mockingbird. Mobius is the tech spot in this list. You could replace that with something else if you want, but in general, 11 out of these 12 cards are pretty mainstay for this archetype right now. I wanted to include a pool 3 list here as well for any budget players. I know budget content isn't overly popular in Snap, but one of the positive things about Arishem being such a strong force in the game is that you can still succeed with it without having many of these pool 4 and pool 5 cards. You can obviously upgrade this list as you see fit with cards you may have in your collection beyond pool 3, but if you're someone who's a newer or returning player, this is not a bad jumping off point. And then if you're looking to make things a little spicy and enjoy hedging your bets and making some big bluffs, well, we have Kang Arishem. I'm sure this is going to surprise some people, but I do think with the unpredictiveness of Arishem, the fact that Kang essentially lets you do some really strategic bluffing in a mode that is all about high stakes and doubling and knowing when to leave and when to stay, I think Kang, for the first time probably since his release, actually has a chance of getting some real value. Use him at your own risk, but I know I'm definitely looking forward to getting some big bluffs off with Kang the Conqueror. Circling back around to the Clog decks previously mentioned, I think these are going to be very, very powerful. These decks have already proved that they're one of the handful of decks that is able to stand up to the full power of Arishem, and they really do benefit from the extra doubling mechanics, given that you often know if you are likely to win or lose the game as early as turn 4 or turn 5, assuming you're able to clog up the opponent and have a finisher to close with. There are a few different variations of the Clog. First up, we have a classic Clog. This is kind of the older version of the list with the addition of the newly buffed Viper, where you're trying to clog up a lane with Widow, Goblin, Debris, Doc Ock, or Viper, and then close out the game with a big, powerful threat like Cannonball, Red Hulk, or killing an opponent's big threat with Shang-Chi. This deck has evolved a little bit though, with the recent release of Ajax, who has been a powerful addition to the archetype. This version has a very similar core here. It's trying to do a lot of the same things. However, it has the Hazmat Ajax option, or another way to close out the game with a big threat. And then if you're not as big a fan of Dr. Octopus, there is actually a no Octopus Clog version from Safety Blade that I've been liking a ton. I do think this one takes a little more practice to get the hang of, but once you do, it is really, really powerful. And one of my favorite things about it is with inclusions like Beast and Carnage, you can sometimes get a leg up in the Clog mirrors, which I expect to be pretty popular. And then the third core pillar of the metagame is these Kitty Pryde Thena mid-range decks. The first of which we're seeing here is just a pretty standard Darkhawk Mystique version, but there are a lot of versions and we're going to go through them here. The general power of this deck though is that the Kitty Thena package can go pretty tall in terms of power. In general, the reason this archetype is so strong is that you can go pretty tall in terms of power while still being able to win versus something like Clog, due to the fact that we have movers that can take up a space in a lane and make it hard for Clog to close down one lane so they can secure a victory. First up, we have a Kitty Darkhawk version, this one specifically as a anti-Arishem kind of tech. I don't think this is quite as good as it was maybe a week ago, but I think it is still fairly good. And if you really, really hate Arishem, it's not a bad way to go. You have your Darkhawk and Mystique, which can just win by themselves. Cosmo for protection. That could also be Juggernaut. It comes down to personal preference. I like Cosmo because it's something you can play out earlier, whereas Juggernaut is something you're more so trying to use on the final turn of the game and requires you to often have priority. Kitty, Thena, Angela have been really strong together. Ravonna makes it easier to play some of our other threats like Mystique, Iron Man, and Sage. Sage being just a generically good stat stick. We have the Rock package, which isn't particularly useful against Arishem, but is pretty important against the non-Arishem decks, both for disruption and growing our Darkhawks. And then Nocturne for location changing, or to help maintain a lane that can't get clogged up. Another version of this I've really liked is the Silky Smooth package. So this has even more ways of preventing Clog with the addition of Jeff, as well as sometimes Silk. But in general, this deck benefits from the fact that we don't have threats that are super duper tall. So we're not as weak to our opponent's Shang-Chi. Gwenpool buffs up a bunch of our more mid-sized threats so they can compete more easily. Captain Marvel's been an absolute MVP because oftentimes I find the Arishem decks are focusing their power on two lanes. so Captain Marvel can kind of help make up for things not going the way you planned, giving you that bit of extra power. And these decks mostly lean pretty heavily on Shang-Chi to deal with the big threats that go taller than this deck is capable of going. Mobius is the flex spot, and I think he is absolutely necessary just to shut down the Quinjets, shut down the Lokis, shut down the Mockingbirds, as well as other more fringe archetypes like Mr. Negative, who I expect to be a little bit more popular during the Diner. Then there's the Mockingbird Sasquatch Mysterio version, which also leverages Gwenpool. You'll notice a very heavy overlap here, and that is because these cards are what makes the deck so strong. But what makes this one a little bit different is we have our Mockingbird and Sasquatch as our cost-reducing threats, Mysterio to help get those cards into play, which also has good synergy with Gwenpool, getting some extra stats if we opt to not play it earlier on in the game. And then Hope Summers to help out with the fact that this curve is a little bit more top-heavy compared to other versions. And then to round out the Kitty decks, we have Kitty Ajax. Again, very similar core here. However, for its power, this one is leading into the Ajax plan, using Hazmat to get a really big Ajax to solo a lane, and then winning another lane with your good Scalers, Juggernaut, Shang-Chi, etc. You really can't go wrong with any of these Kitty, Athena, Angela decks, but I'd recommend picking the one you feel most comfortable with. So those are the three main archetypes I think will be dominating Deadpool's Diner, both because of how generally strong and defining they have been in the metagame, and also because they naturally benefit from the increased stakes in the Diner. As one final bonus deck, I wanted to include Mr. Negative here as another kind of budget option, so to speak. Negative is a textbook example of the kind of deck where you know if you are or are not going to have a good chance of winning the game by turn 4, because you'll know if you've had your negative or not by then, and if you don't, well, this list probably isn't going to win the game. So while it's not necessarily as strong as the other archetypes, especially in terms of win rate, I think it can leverage the doubling down system very effectively. This is a pretty standard negative list. I opted to go with Sage over Null. If you don't have her, you definitely could put Null in this spot. That's just kind of a personal preference, but you're trying to get Mr. Negative down as early as turn 3 with Ravonna and Sage, get a bunch of good flips, maybe even draw all your zeros with Jane, and then you have Darkhawk here as a bonus for solid stats that can just solo the Arishem gamer. Unfortunately though, with Dr. Octopus and Leech being really popular, it remains to be seen just how good Mr. Negative will be, but nonetheless, I do think in terms of budget options, probably one of the better ones to consider. One last thing I do want to mention is that you don't necessarily have to play the three main archetypes outlined in the video here to succeed in the Diner. I'm sure there will be plenty of other decks that do find success, but these are the decks that at the very least I think you should be keeping in mind in order to find success with other options. So whether it's because you don't have the cards or maybe you don't feel as confident in playing these particular archetypes, I don't want people thinking they're the only option for finding success. So there we have it, everything you need to know about Deadpool's Diner, as well as some decks that I think are very well positioned to get you those bubs and the Cassandra Nova card and variant. As always, I'll have links in the description if you want to grab any of these decks to import into the game for yourself, as well as a link listing all the various rewards and when you get them in the Diner. I plan on streaming this mode quite a bit because I think it's a fairly interesting concept, so if you want to see some live gameplay with these decks in action, definitely come swing by the Twitch channel, link in the description. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, remember to like and subscribe. Let me know what you think about Deadpool's Diner in the comments below. That's going to wrap it up for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.